Life inside the worst maximum security prisons in the USA. ADX Florence, Pelican Bay and more. The concrete labyrinth. If you're ready to walk the darkest corridors of America's justice system, hit subscribe now because what you're about to hear isn't fiction. It's real, it's documented, and it's going to change how you see maximum security forever. The first light of dawn slid over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains as a white Bureau of Prisons bus rumbled along Highway 67 toward Florence, Colorado. Inside sat 4 inmates in shackles, silent and hooded, their ankles chained to steel rings bolted to the floor. The bus didn't slow as it passed the medium security complex and the nearby camp. It kept going until the desert gave way to a fortress of pale concrete and razor wire. This was the Administrative Maximum Facility, ADX Florence, the highest security prison in the United States, nicknamed the Alcatraz of the Rockies. It had been built to end the chaos of the old federal penitentiaries. Instead, it became a symbol of absolute control. From above, ADX looks like a massive X carved into the earth. Inside each wing is a sealed world of soundproof doors, 4-inch wide windows and camera lenses the size of pinheads. Prisoners spend 23 hours a day in cells no bigger than a parking space, with a concrete bed, concrete desk and concrete stool. The only view is a slice of sky. Recreation happens alone in a high-walled pen called the Dog Run. Meals slide through a slot. Human contact is a memory. In cell 234, a man once known across America as the Unabomber sat cross-legged on his concrete bunk, flipping through a battered paperback. Ted Kaczynski had arrived here after pleading guilty to a 17-year mail bombing spree that killed 3 people and injured 23. Here, even his notoriety didn't earn him special treatment. His mail was photocopied, his phone calls logged, his few legal visits held through glass. The Bureau of Prisons called it administrative segregation. Former wardens called it a prison inside a prison. Inmates called it the box. 3 states away on California's remote north coast, another box stood among redwoods and mist, Pelican Bay State Prison. Its Security Housing Unit, or SHU, was designed to isolate suspected gang leaders from the general population. Some men spent decades there with no physical contact, no programs and no release date from solitary. In the early 1990s, lawsuits exposed a pattern of excessive force and what prisoners called gladiator fights, in which guards allegedly released rival gang members into the yard together. In April 1992, mentally ill prisoner Von Dorch was scalded while handcuffed in a hot water tub by guards trying to forcibly clean him, leaving him with 2nd and 3rd degree burns. Photographs of his injuries became evidence in Madrid versus Gomez, the landmark case that condemned conditions at Pelican Bay. By the summer of 2011, tensions in Pelican Bay's SHU had boiled over. Thousands of inmates launched a hunger strike demanding an end to indefinite isolation, better medical care, and the right to 1 phone call per week. The protest spread to other California prisons, drawing international headlines. 2 years later, a second hunger strike dwarfed the first, with nearly 30,000 prisoners refusing meals. Families rallied outside prison gates, holding signs with names and photos of men they hadn't touched in decades. Lawmakers held hearings. The state eventually settled Ashker versus Governor of California, agreeing to curtail indefinite solitary confinement. Back in Colorado, the Bureau of Prisons had always defended ADX as necessary for the worst of the worst. But by 2012, even ADX faced its own class action lawsuit over the treatment of mentally ill prisoners. Lawyers alleged that men were deteriorating in isolation, smearing feces, cutting themselves and hearing voices. Court filings described a horrific cycle of untreated illness and punishment. The case led to a rare settlement and policy changes, but not before years of suffering had been documented. In the bus's back row sat another shackled man, older, gaunt, his eyes fixed on nothing. He had once been a fixture of California's Supermax system, a name that appeared in gang intelligence reports but never in headlines. Now he was being transferred to ADX under a new identity. Federal marshals called him a management variable, a term for inmates considered too influential or dangerous to be housed anywhere else. His file included a note: long-term SHU confinement, Pelican Bay, suspected nuestra familia associate, psychological deterioration observed. As the bus rolled through ADX's Sally Port, the man's stomach tightened. He had survived decades in a windowless cell at Pelican Bay. He had led hunger strikes, written legal petitions, watched friends die in isolation. He had dreamed of daylight. Now he was entering a place built to outdo everything he'd endured. His shackles rattled as he shifted on the metal bench. Hours later, in a Washington, D.C. conference room, a Justice Department analyst named Emily Carter pored over two thick binders. One labeled ADX Florence, Mental Health Litigation, the other Pelican Bay, SHU Reform. She had been assigned to cross-reference cases after a series of suspicious letters arrived at congressional offices, each containing hand-drawn maps of prison layouts and lists of inmate names. Some of the handwriting matched Ted Kaczynski's early manifestos. Some matched a man in California who had disappeared into the SHU years ago. All the letters warned of a foundation cracking beneath the system. Carter had been to neither prison. She had never met an inmate. But as she compared the documents, hunger strike demands from Pelican Bay, sealed declarations from ADX, a pattern began to emerge. Transfers of certain high-profile prisoners coincided with sudden flare-ups. Lawsuits filed, leaks to journalists, contraband cell phones found in other facilities. Someone was orchestrating something from within isolation itself. Late that afternoon, a routine mail scan at ADX intercepted a legal envelope addressed to inmate 89,273-123, the transfer from Pelican Bay. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in grid lines and tiny numbers. No words. The officer logged it as inmate's legal notes and sent it on. Cameras caught the man sliding it under his mattress. By nightfall, a cold front swept down from the mountains, bringing snow and static. In the control room, monitors flickered. For 3 seconds, the camera outside cell 234, Ted Kaczynski's old cell, went black. When the feed returned, everything looked normal. But in the still frame later pulled from the recording, a blurred shape seemed to stand in the hallway, just beyond the range of the light, before vanishing again. Back in her DC office, Carter highlighted a line from a sealed deposition by a former Pelican Bay inmate now housed at ADX. It read, "We built a tunnel in our minds first. The walls only look solid." She frowned. It wasn't a literal tunnel. It was a metaphor, wasn't it? 2 days later, an inspector at Pelican Bay reviewing old evidence boxes found a copy of a hunger strike manifesto with a map sketched on the back. The map's legend read simply, Florence. That night, in a tiny ADX cell, the transferred inmate unfolded his grid paper under the dim light. Hidden in the numbers was a pattern, coordinates to an unused service corridor beneath the prison. He began tapping them into the steel bed frame, one by one, as if signaling through the concrete walls. Cracks in the walls. Snow drifted across the high desert as dawn broke over Florence. Inside ADX, the daily routine churned on like clockwork. Breakfast trays sliding through slots, guards pacing silent corridors, surveillance cameras swiveling in endless arcs. But in one cell, the transferred inmate from Pelican Bay sat on his bunk, grid paper spread out before him like a treasure map. The numbers he'd memorized corresponded to old service corridors and utility chases he'd seen years earlier when he'd been a trustee on a construction crew at Pelican Bay. He'd never been inside ADX until now, yet the angles and measurements on the paper felt eerily familiar. Somewhere, somehow, someone had given him a key to the labyrinth. Across the country, in a drab DOJ office, Emily Carter shut her laptop and stared at a printout of the same numbers. A data analyst by training, she had run them through mapping software out of curiosity. To her shock, the coordinates lined up with sealed maintenance spaces under ADX built during its original construction in the early 1990s. In those years, cost overruns and contractor changes had left incomplete passages and unused shafts. They weren't on the public blueprints, but they existed. She had found evidence buried in appropriations audits. Now the same coordinates had surfaced in inmate mail. She called a contact at the Bureau of Prisons. "These aren't just doodles," she said. "They're real locations." Her contact hesitated. "Emily, you're playing with fire. Florence is on high alert after those hunger strike leaks. If you go poking around, they'll shut you out." But she'd already booked a flight to Denver. She needed to see it for herself. Inside ADX, Lieutenant Mark Harris did his morning rounds. He'd been at Florence for a decade and had seen everything. Cartel bosses who never left their cells, domestic terrorists filing endless lawsuits, gang leaders trying to run operations through coded legal mail. But something about this new inmate bothered him. The man's eyes weren't wild or broken like so many long-term SHU veterans. They were calculating, steady. Harris noted in the log, inmate 89,273-123 exhibiting pattern behavior, tapping sounds after lights out. 2 days later, Emily arrived at the small regional airport and drove south toward Florence. As she crested a hill, the prison complex came into view. 4 facilities nested like Russian dolls, The camp, the low, the medium, and at the far end ADX with its snaking perimeter road. She pulled over, snapping a photo on her phone. Even from miles away, it radiated secrecy. She met Harris in a break room off the control center. At first he was stiff, but when she slid the coordinates across the table, he frowned. "Where did you get these?" he asked. She told him about the letters. He rubbed his forehead. "Some of these areas were sealed before I started here. But yeah, they're real. Utility chases, abandoned crawl spaces. You're telling me an inmate has this?" Back in the cell, the transferred inmate traced the lines on his paper with his finger, imagining the passages beneath his feet. He wasn't planning an escape, not yet. What he wanted was leverage. For decades he'd been buried alive in Pelican Bay's SHU. He'd watched hunger strikes come and go, lawsuits drag on for years, reforms inch forward. Now he was at the heart of the federal system's crown jewel. If he could prove that even ADX was vulnerable, his words might finally carry weight. Harris agreed to show Emily one of the sealed corridors during a routine maintenance check. They descended a narrow stairwell to sublevel C, the air cooler and heavier than above. Pipes ran along the ceiling, dripping condensation. At the end of a hallway, Harris pried open a rusted service door. Inside was a low concrete space filled with abandoned cable spools and dust. He swept his flashlight over graffiti on the wall, old names, dates, and a crude drawing of a raven. "Construction guys left this behind in '93, he said. "We sealed it up after September 11th, but no one's been down here since." Emily crouched, examining the floor. Faint footprints led toward a secondary hatch. "Are these yours?" she asked. Harris shook his head. "We don't use this passage." He radioed for a motion sensor sweep. Static crackled back. "Negative, sensors offline." He swore under his breath. Upstairs, the inmate folded his grid paper into a tiny square and pressed it under the edge of his sink. He'd sent out another coded letter that morning, disguised as a legal filing. If it reached the right hands on the outside, journalists would have blueprints of ADX's hidden arteries, proof of how the most secure prison wasn't as airtight as advertised. It wasn't an escape plan, it was a pressure point. That night, a guard scanning mail in another wing found a legal envelope addressed to an attorney in San Francisco. Inside was a single phrase, "The foundation is cracking." He flagged it but wasn't sure what it meant. He put it back on the outgoing tray. Emily and Harris emerged from the maintenance space unsettled. She told him about the hunger strikes, about the long-term solitary confinement and the lawsuits. "People think these places are impenetrable," she said. "But isolation creates desperation. Desperation breeds ingenuity." Harris stared at the snow falling through the yard lights. "If you're right, then someone's turning ADX into their own Pelican Bay, using secrecy as a weapon." The next morning, a technician noticed something odd in the control room logs. For exactly 4 seconds overnight, a door in the special security unit had cycled open, then shut. No one had keyed it. No alarm had sounded. The cameras had briefly flickered. The incident was filed as a glitch. In cell 89,273 to 123, the inmate lay awake, eyes on the ceiling. He whispered to himself the names of men still locked in Pelican Bay's SHU, men he'd promised to fight for. This wasn't about freedom. It was about exposure. Phase 2 was nearly complete. At 4:17 a.m., as Emily reviewed her notes in a motel room outside Florence, her phone buzzed. An encrypted email had arrived from an unknown sender. Attached was a photo taken from inside ADX's sub-basement, the same sealed corridor she'd just visited, with a handwritten note across the image. "Phase 3 begins tomorrow." Exposure. Snow fell harder over Florence as dawn broke. Inside ADX, the corridors glowed dim blue under emergency lights. The control room buzzed with muted panic. Another sensor had gone offline in sublevel C. For the third night in a row, a door in the special security unit had cycled open for a few seconds without an access code. Supervisors whispered about sabotage. Someone had ordered a lockdown, but the building's heart kept flickering like a pulse. Emily Carter arrived at the prison with her DOJ credentials and the mysterious photo she'd received overnight. She showed it to Lieutenant Harris. His face went pale. "That's the sealed corridor we went into yesterday," he said. "How does someone have a picture from inside it?" Emily shook her head. "Whoever's orchestrating this is feeding evidence out in real time." They descended again into the sub-basement, this time with a full tactical escort. The air was colder, the dripping pipes louder. They rounded the corner where the maintenance room opened into darkness. The footprints from before were deeper now, fresh in the dust. The hatch at the far wall stood ajar. Inside the hidden chamber, a single battery-powered router blinked green. Wires snaked from it into the fiber trunk feeding ADX's security network. A makeshift server hummed quietly. On its screen scrolled lines of data. Visitor logs, disciplinary reports, internal memos. Everything. Harris swore. Emily stepped closer. "He's not trying to break out," she murmured. "He's copying the prison." Back upstairs, inmate 89,273 to 123 sat calmly on his bunk. His legal mail had already gone out, encrypted in innocuous filings. Years of hunger strikes and ignored grievances had taught him one lesson. You couldn't force reform from inside. But you could make secrecy impossible. If journalists, lawyers, and families could see what really happened behind these walls, the conditions, the mental breakdowns, the quiet deaths, then the image of the most secure prison would crack. Harris's radio crackled. "We've got a match," a technician said. "The router's IP is tunneling to an external news server. The dump's already live." Harris looked at Emily. She nodded grimly. "Stop it if you can, but the story's already out." At that moment, phones buzzed in newsrooms across the country. An anonymous source had sent a data trove labeled, "Life Inside the Worst Maximum Security Prisons." It contained years of sealed filings, hunger strike affidavits, mental health reports, and internal blueprints from ADX and Pelican Bay. Within minutes, journalists were tweeting excerpts. Cable news ran banners, "Leaked documents expose secrets of America's Supermax prisons." Inside ADX, supervisors scrambled. The warden ordered inmate 89,273 to 123 moved to a different wing. Guards opened his door. He rose without resistance, hands out for cuffs. As they led him past the cameras, he looked straight at Harris and Emily. "I told you," he said quietly. "Walls only look solid." Emily stared back. In that moment she understood. The man had turned his own imprisonment into a final act of witness. He hadn't escaped, but he had made sure no one else would be invisible. 2 days later, congressional hearings were announced. Families of Pelican Bay hunger strikers held vigils in Sacramento. Amnesty International called for an independent investigation into ADX. The Bureau of Prisons promised reforms. Inmate 89,273 to 123 disappeared into an undisclosed federal facility. Emily returned to Washington with a hard drive of the leaked files. She filed her report, knowing it would trigger a storm. At night she lay awake, wondering who had really helped the inmates smuggle out so much data. No one had yet claimed credit. The servers in the hidden chamber had been wiped before agents could image them. A single note had been left on the floor, written on graph paper. "The foundation is yours now." Months passed. Reforms were debated. Some changes came, others stalled. Then one morning, a new envelope landed on Emily's desk. Inside was a map of another prison, a place she didn't recognize, and a handwritten line at the bottom. Phase 4 begins soon. She sat back, staring at the map as the city bustled outside her window. For the first time she felt the walls of her own office closing in. If you thought this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the next set of walls starts to crack.